Have you ever had one of those days where something small, like a broken Wi-Fi, turns into something life-changing? Something that shifts everything you thought you knew about yourself and the world around you? Well, today's story is exactly that. One quiet Tuesday evening, our protagonist's Wi-Fi went out just as they were about to submit a crucial project. Desperate for help, they turned to their neighbor, John, a man they barely knew but had always found intriguing. Little did they know, this simple request for help would lead to an unforgettable night. One filled with unexpected connections, vulnerability, and the realization that sometimes love finds you in the most unexpected places. It all began on a quiet Tuesday evening. After spending the better part of the day hopping between virtual meetings and managing a growing list of work deadlines, they finally settled into a comfortable rhythm of productivity, or so they thought. But just as they were about to submit a crucial project, the Wi-Fi betrayed them. The blinking red light on the router was a glaring sign of defeat. Frustrated, they closed their laptop with more force than necessary, panic beginning to seep in. How were they going to meet their deadline without the internet? Their phone's mobile data was patchy at best, and the idea of heading out to a coffee shop at this hour didn't appeal to them at all. Pacing the living room, they ran through their options before remembering their neighbor, John. John was a man of around 60 who had moved into the apartment next door a few months ago. Although their interactions had been brief, polite hellos and quick exchanges in the hallway, he had always struck them as approachable, tall, and effortlessly charming. John carried a quiet confidence that made people instinctively trust him. Something in the look in his eyes told them he got everything out of life. The tension between them was something they couldn't quite explain, but it felt exciting. Maybe they didn't know it yet, but John was not only interested in women. Hesitating for a moment, they debated whether to knock on his door, but desperation won out over awkwardness. Wrapping themselves in a sweater, they stepped out into the dimly lit hallway. Their heart thudded slightly faster than it should have, though they told themselves it was purely the stress of the deadline. Knocking lightly at first, then a little harder when there was no immediate answer. The door opened within seconds, revealing John. He was dressed in a casual gray hoodie and sweatpants. His hair slightly mussed as though he'd just woken from a nap. His surprised expression quickly melted into a friendly smile. "Wow, what a charming man," he greeted, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Hey neighbor, what's up?" "My Wi-Fi is out," they said, trying to keep the panic from creeping into their voice. "I was wondering if you might know a thing or two about fixing routers." "I'm in a bit of a bind." John chuckled softly, the sound surprisingly soothing. "Sure, let me grab my tools. Give me a sec." Relief washed over them as he disappeared into his apartment. When he returned, he carried a small toolkit and gestured for them to lead the way back into their apartment. They couldn't help but feel a little self-conscious as John surveyed the space. It wasn't messy, but something about having someone else see the pile of books on the coffee table or the unwashed mug on the kitchen counter made them want to tidy up immediately. "This shouldn't take long," John said as he knelt by the router, his hands already working to untangle the cords. His movements were steady and sure, and they found themselves watching him more than they probably should have. His focus was almost mesmerizing. His brow furrowed just slightly as he examined the device. "You've got a decent setup here," he remarked, glancing up at them with a small smile. "Oh, thanks. I just sort of threw things together when I moved in," they replied, leaning against the back of the couch. "Do you do this kind of thing a lot?" "Yeah, I dabble," John said with a shrug. "Mostly I just help friends and family when their tech decides to act up. It's usually nothing serious." "Well, I really appreciate it," they said. "I have a deadline tonight, and I was starting to feel a little desperate." "No problem," John replied. "Deadlines wait for no one, right?" They nodded, letting out a small laugh. For the next few minutes, the only sounds in the room were the faint clicks of his tools and the occasional hum of approval as he made progress. They tried to focus on anything other than how comfortable he seemed in their space, how naturally he moved as though he belonged there. So John began breaking the silence. "What's got you working so late?" "Big project." "Yeah, it's for a client," they said, gesturing toward their laptop on the table. "I'm a freelance graphic designer, so it's kind of nonstop sometimes." Ah, the glamorous life of freelancing, John said with a grin. People think it's all working from coffee shops and taking midday naps, right? They don't see the 2 a.m. panic sessions. They joked, and John laughed, the sound rich and genuine. Well, it sounds like you've got it under control, even with the Wi-Fi rebelling. The conversation flowed, and they found themselves relaxing more and more. John had an easy way of making people feel at ease. His humor was light, but never forced. By the time he tightened the last cable and stood, brushing his hands off, they realized how much they'd enjoyed talking to him. "All right," John said, gesturing to the now stable green light on the router. "You should be back online." They exhaled in relief. "Thank you so much. You're a lifesaver." "It's nothing," John said with a wave of his hand. "But if it gives you trouble again, let me know." As he prepared to leave, they couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment. They weren't ready for the interaction to end just yet. On impulse, they spoke up. "Hey, can I at least offer you a coffee or something as a thank you?" John hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Sure, I wouldn't say no to a cup of coffee." Moving to the kitchen, they felt a strange mixture of nerves and excitement as they poured 2 mugs. When they handed John his, he took it with a nod of thanks, leaning against the counter as he took a sip. "This is good," he said, his voice warm. "You're spoiling me now." They laughed. "It's the least I can do after you save my deadline." They fell into easy conversation again, talking about everything from the quirks of the apartment building to their favorite local spots. Time seemed to stretch and blur, the storm outside forgotten as the connection between them deepened. It was only when the sound of thunder rolled in the distance that they realized how late it had gotten. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the overhead light, and for a moment, everything felt strangely intimate. John's gaze lingered on theirs, a quiet intensity in his eyes that made their breath catch. There was something between them that told them there was something coming, and they knew he felt it too. "Thanks for the coffee," John said eventually, his voice softer now. "Anytime." Their heart raced for reasons they couldn't quite explain. And as John left, the silence in their apartment felt heavier than usual. Something about the evening had shifted, though they weren't entirely sure what it was. All they knew was that they wouldn't be forgetting this night anytime soon, and that this wasn't over. But what they didn't know was that this was going to repeat itself and end in a whole different way. When he was gone, their mind was far from the solitude of their apartment. They stared at the router, its steady green light mocking the turmoil swirling within them. What had just happened? It wasn't just the Wi-Fi. John had fixed something intangible that had shifted between them, and they couldn't quite name it. They busied themselves pretending to refocus on the project that had consumed their day. But their thoughts were elsewhere. The way John had smiled when he sipped his coffee, the soft laugh that seemed to resonate long after he left. The moment their eyes met and lingered just a fraction too long, all of it replayed in their mind like a highlight reel. They couldn't turn it off. The rain outside picked up again, a rhythmic patter against the window that mirrored the steady hum of their heartbeat. Glancing at their phone, they debated whether to text him a quick thank you, though it felt unnecessary. Instead, they scrolled aimlessly through their emails, trying to distract themselves from the inexplicable warmth that had settled in their chest. An hour passed, maybe 2, before the knock startled them. Their heart leaped into their throat as they turned toward the door. Who could it be at this hour? Crossing the room, they opened it cautiously, and there he was again, John, holding a small flashlight and wearing an apologetic grin. "Hey," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Sorry to bother you again, but I left one of my tools here. Mind if I come in and grab it?" "Of course," they said, their voice catching slightly before they stepped aside. "Come on in." John entered, his presence once again filling the space in a way that felt too natural. He scanned the room briefly before spotting the small screwdriver on the coffee table. "There it is," he said, picking it up and holding it up like a trophy. "Can't believe I forgot this." "Must have been the coffee," they teased, trying to keep their tone light. "Must have been," he echoed, his lips curving into a small smile. But he didn't move to leave. Instead, he glanced out the window, watching the rain trail down the glass. "It's really coming down out there." "Yeah," they said, following his gaze. It's one of those nights. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet was punctuated only by the sound of rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. John turned to them then, his expression thoughtful. You know, I've lived here for months, but this is the first real conversation we've had. They nodded, suddenly self-conscious. Guess we've both been busy. True, he said, his voice soft. But I'm glad we finally did. The air between them shifted again, thick with something unspoken. They could feel his gaze on them, warm and steady, and it took all their effort to meet it without faltering. Their breath hitched slightly as he stepped closer, not enough to crowd them, but enough to make the space between them feel almost tangible. I should probably get going, John said after a moment, though his tone lacked conviction. Yeah, they replied, barely above a whisper. Neither of them moved. Before they could second-guess themselves, they spoke. John, can I ask you something? Of course, he said, his eyes searching theirs. Why did you really come back? The question hung in the air, vulnerable and raw. They weren't even sure why they'd asked it, but they couldn't take it back now. John hesitated, his hand tightening slightly around the flashlight he held. Honestly, he said, his voice low, I wasn't ready to leave. His words sent a jolt through them, equal parts thrilling and terrifying. They didn't know what to say. Their mind raced with 1,000 thoughts that refused to settle into coherence. John must have seen the conflict in their expression because he stepped back slightly, giving them space. I'm sorry if that's too much, he said, his voice genuine. Tonight felt different. It did, they admitted, surprising themselves with the honesty of their response. John's eyes softened, his lips curving into a small, almost relieved smile. Well, he said after a beat, his tone lighter now. I guess I should let you get back to your deadline. Don't want to be the guy who distracts the freelancer. They laughed, the tension breaking slightly. You already are, they teased. He chuckled, holding up his hands in mock surrender. Guilty as charged. As he turned to leave, the weight in the room lifted slightly, though a part of them wanted to stop him, to say something, anything, that would keep him here just a little longer. But they didn't. Instead, they walked him to the door, watching as he stepped into the hallway. Good night, John, they said, their voice softer than they intended. Good night, he replied, his smile lingering even as the door closed behind him. They leaned against the door for a moment, their hearts still racing. Tonight had felt like the beginning of something, though they couldn't quite put it into words. All they knew was that their usually quiet apartment felt quieter now, and for the first time in a long while, they weren't sure they liked it. The following evening, they found themselves glancing toward the hallway more often than they cared to admit. John's visit had left a lingering impression they couldn't shake. And now every creak of the floorboards or muffled sound from the hallway had their pulse quickening with anticipation. It was maddening, but also undeniable. He was on their mind. They tried to focus on work, but the images of his warm smile and the quiet confidence in his voice played on repeat. They had never thought much about John beyond the occasional neighborly wave or polite exchange, but now it was as though he occupied every corner of their thoughts. The knock on their door startled them so much that they almost knocked over their coffee. Setting the mug down quickly, they made their way to the door, their heart pounding for reasons they couldn't justify. When they opened it, there he was again, standing with that same easy smile that somehow managed to disarm them every time. Hey, John said, holding up a small toolkit. I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but I was reviewing your setup in my head last night, and I realized there's a small adjustment we could make to improve your signal stability. Mind if I take another look for a moment? They just stared at him, caught off guard by his unexpected return, but then they stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. Sure, if it helps, why not? Promise this won't take long, he said, walking to the router with an air of focus. As John crouched by the router again, they leaned against the counter, watching him work. He moved with the same calm efficiency as before, his brow furrowed slightly in concentration. They tried to act casual, but the quiet buzz of anticipation was impossible to ignore. You weren't kidding about being thorough, they said, breaking the silence. He glanced up, his lips curving into a small smile. What can I say? I'm a bit of a perfectionist. They laughed softly, shaking their head. Well, I appreciate it. Though I have to admit, I didn't expect you to make a second trip for my Wi-Fi. His smile deepened, his eyes meeting theirs for a moment longer than necessary. I guess I'm full of surprises. The air between them shifted again, thick with an unspoken energy that seemed to hum just beneath the surface. They found themselves holding their breath, unsure of what to say or do. John must have sensed it too, because he cleared his throat, turning his attention back to the router. So, he said, his tone casual but his voice softer now. What's keeping you busy tonight? More deadlines, unfortunately, they said, gesturing toward their laptop. The glamorous life of a freelancer, John chuckled, shaking his head. It has its moments, they admitted, smiling despite themselves. But most of the time, it's just me, my laptop, and way too much coffee. He nodded thoughtfully, his fingers deftly adjusting the cables as he spoke. I get that. My job's kind of the same. Just me, a computer, and troubleshooting other people's problems. Sometimes it feels like I spend more time fixing things for others than focusing on what I really want to do. They tilted their head, intrigued by the vulnerability in his tone. And what is it you really want to do? John paused, glancing at them with an expression that was equal parts hesitant and sincere. Photography, he said finally. It's always been my passion, but I guess I got caught up in the practical side of things. Bills to pay, responsibilities to juggle. They nodded, understanding the weight of his words. It's not easy, is it, balancing what you love with what you have to do? No, it's not, he said, his voice carrying a note of wistfulness. But it's conversations like this that remind me why I fell in love with it in the first place. They smiled, feeling a warmth spread through their chest. Well, for what it's worth, I think you should go for it. Life's too short not to chase the things that make you happy. John's gaze softened, and for a moment, they felt as though the rest of the world had fallen away. His eyes held theirs, and the quiet intensity of his expression sent their heart racing. Thanks, he said after a beat, his voice low. That means a lot. The sound of thunder rolling in the distance broke the moment, snapping them back to reality. John straightened, brushing his hands together as though wiping away the weight of the conversation. All set, he said, his tone lighter now. Your Wi-Fi should be solid as a rock. Guess that means no more excuses to knock on my door. They teased, though the words felt heavier than they intended. Guess not, John chuckled, his smile softening. As he gathered his tools, they felt a pang of reluctance at the thought of him leaving again. It was strange the way his presence had a way of filling the space so effortlessly, like he belonged there. But they didn't say anything, afraid of what it might mean if they did. At the door, John turned back, his expression unreadable. Thanks for letting me tinker with your setup again, and for the conversation, he said. Anytime, they said, their voice softer than they intended. With one last smile, he stepped in a hallway, and they closed the door behind him. The room felt quieter now, though the energy he'd left behind lingered like an invisible thread pulling at the edges of their thoughts. Now they were really sure that the next time they saw him, crazy things would happen. They could just feel it. He told them that with the look in his eyes. The following days passed in a strange blur, the routine moments of their life now tinged with an undercurrent of anticipation. It wasn't like John and they had made any plans to see each other again, but they found themselves hoping, wondering if the sound of a knock on their door would announce his presence once more. His visit had left a mark, small but undeniable, and the space he filled seemed more noticeable in his absence. One stormy evening, the lights flickered again, though the Wi-Fi held steady this time. Still, they couldn't shake the memory of John standing by the router, his brow furrowed in concentration. The way he seemed so effortlessly present in their apartment. As they sipped their tea and stared at the glowing screen of their laptop, they wondered if he was home too, possibly thinking about the conversations they'd shared just as they were beginning to lose themselves in their thoughts. There was a knock at the door. Their hearts skipped a beat, a rush of excitement coursing through them, even as they tried to temper their expectations. They set their mug down and crossed the room, pausing for a brief moment before opening the door. John stood there, the same easy smile on his face, but with a slight hesitation in his posture. His hand rested on the doorframe, and they noticed the faint sheen of rain on his jacket. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," they said quickly, stepping aside to let him in. "Come in." He walked in, glancing around the room as though taking stock of his surroundings. "I was heading out for a walk when the storm hit harder than I expected. Figured I'd stop by to say hi instead of getting completely soaked." They laughed softly, gesturing toward the couch. "Good call. Looks like it's going to be a rough one out there." John sat down, his presence instantly filling the space in a way that felt natural and familiar. They joined him, tucking their legs beneath them as the sound of rain intensified against the windows. "So, how is the Wi-Fi holding up?" he asked, a teasing grin tugging at his lips. "Perfect, thanks to you," they said, smiling. "Though I think I miss having an excuse to call for help." His gaze lingered on them for a moment, his smile softening. "I think you're doing just fine without me." The words hung in the air between them, charged with an energy that made their chests tighten. They looked away, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, the space between them almost non-existent. "Do you want something warm to drink?" they asked, standing up abruptly to break the tension. "That'd be great," he said, his voice warm. "Thanks." As they moved to the kitchen, they tried to steady their breathing, their mind racing with the weight of his presence. It wasn't just the way he looked at them or the way his voice seemed to wrap around them like a blanket. It was the way he made them feel seen and understood in a way that they hadn't realized they were craving. They returned with 2 mugs of tea, handing one to John before settling back on the couch. The storm outside raged on, thunder rumbling in the distance as the rain poured relentlessly. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sounds coming from the storm and the occasional clink of their mugs against the table. "I was thinking about what you said the other day," John began, his voice breaking the quiet, "about chasing what makes you happy." They glanced at him, surprised. "Yeah," he nodded, his gaze steady. "It's been a long time since someone said something that stuck with me like that." "I don't know," he continued, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "I guess I just wanted to thank you." "You don't have to thank me," they said softly. "I was just being honest." "Still," he said, "it's rare to meet someone who reminds you of the things you've forgotten about yourself." His words sent a shiver down their spine, though they weren't sure if it was from the intensity of his gaze or the way he seemed to peel back layers of them with such ease. They looked down at their hands, suddenly unsure of what to do or say. "The storm's really picking up," John said after a beat, glancing toward the window. "Guess I picked the worst night to wander out." "Well, you're safe here," they said, their voice barely above a whisper. "You're welcome to stay until it lets up." "Thanks," he said, his lips curving into a small smile. "I appreciate that." As the minutes ticked by, the storm outside seemed to grow fiercer, the sound of thunder and rain blending into a symphony of chaos. Inside, though, everything felt still, the space between them charged with an unspoken connection that neither of them seemed ready to address. John leaned back against the couch, his arm resting along the back of it. His proximity was impossible to ignore, the heat of his presence seeping into the air between them. They found themselves glancing at him out of the corner of their eye, their heart pounding as they caught the faintest hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Can I ask you something?" he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Of course," they said, their throat dry. "Why haven't we talked like this before?" he asked, his gaze searching theirs. "I mean, we've been neighbors for a while now, but it feels like we've just started to really see each other." The question caught them off guard, and for a moment, they didn't know how to respond. They swallowed hard, their mind racing as they tried to find the right words. "I guess I didn't realize how much I was missing until now," they said finally, their voice barely above a whisper. John's gaze softened, his expression unreadable. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Me too." The air between them seemed to hum with unspoken possibilities, the weight of everything they weren't saying pressing against the edges of the moment. And as the storm outside reached its peak, they felt a shift within themselves, a quiet but undeniable realization that whatever was happening between them was far from ordinary. The storm continued to rage outside, its fury punctuated by sharp cracks of thunder and bursts of lightning that lit up the apartment in brief, dramatic flashes. Inside, though, the air between John and them had reached a different kind of intensity, one that seemed to drown out the chaos beyond the walls. Then he leaned slightly closer, his hand rushing against the back of the couch. His expression shifted to something they couldn't quite read. For a moment, they couldn't look away, drawn to the way his gaze softened, the way it seemed to settle on them like they were the only thing in the room worth seeing. "I've got to admit," John said softly, his voice low and even, "this storm might be the best excuse I've had to knock on your door." They felt a laugh bubbling up in their chest, but it came out as more of a nervous exhale. "You don't need a storm to knock," they said, their voice quieter than they intended. "You're always welcome here." John's smile widened slightly, though there was a weight behind it that suggested something unsaid. "That's good to know," he said after a beat, his tone almost teasing. "But I might just keep finding excuses anyway." They couldn't help but smile, though their heart felt like it was pounding in their throat. "You don't strike me as someone who needs excuses," they said, trying to keep their voice steady. John chuckled softly, leaning back against the couch, but keeping his eyes on them. "Maybe not," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But with you, I think I've been overthinking everything." The words hung in the air between them, charged with a meaning that made their pulse race. They opened their mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Their thoughts tangled together in a way that left them speechless. John didn't seem to mind, though. If anything, his expression softened even further, a quiet patience settling into the curve of his lips. The silence stretched on, not awkward, but heavy with possibility. Outside, the rain lashed against the windows, the storm's ferocity matching the tumult in their chest. They shifted slightly, tucking their legs beneath them as they tried to steady their breathing. They began, though they weren't even sure what they were trying to say. But before they could finish, John moved closer, his hand rushing against theirs where it rested on the couch. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a jolt through them that was impossible to ignore. They looked up, meeting his gaze, and found themselves unable to look away. "You should probably what?" he asked, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. They swallowed hard, the words catching in their throat. "I don't know," they admitted, their voice barely audible. John's lips curved into a small, almost teasing smile. "Then maybe you don't need to do anything," he said simply. The simplicity of his words was disarming. And before they could stop themselves, they were smiling too. The tension between them seemed to shift, softening into something warmer, something that felt less like uncertainty and more like inevitability. And as John reached out, his hand settling gently on theirs, they felt a strange sense of calm wash over them, even as their heart continued to race. "I'm glad I came over tonight," he said after a moment, his thumb brushing lightly against the back of their hand. "I've been thinking about it for a while." Actually, they blinked, caught off guard. "Really?" He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've always felt like there was something here," he said, his voice careful but sincere. "But I wasn't sure if it was just me." "It's not just you," they said quickly, surprising themselves with the honesty of their response. John's eyes met theirs, a spark of something unspoken passing between them. For a moment, neither of them moved, the air between them thick with anticipation. And then slowly, he leaned in, his gaze dropping to their lips before flicking back up to meet their eyes. "Is this okay?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. They nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Their heart was pounding so loudly it was a wonder he couldn't hear it, but they didn't care. In that moment, nothing else mattered. When his lips met theirs, it was like the storm outside had disappeared entirely. The world narrowed to just the two of them, the warmth of his touch, the softness of his kiss. It wasn't hurried or frantic, it was steady, deliberate, like he wanted to savor every second. Their hands moved almost of their own accord, settling on his shoulders as they leaned into him. The closeness between them erased any lingering doubt. The kiss deepened, and they felt themselves sinking into the moment, into him. His hands cradled their face, his touch firm but gentle. And they couldn't help but smile against his lips, a quiet laugh escaping before they could stop it. John pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against theirs as he smiled too. "What?" he asked, his voice warm with amusement. "Nothing," they said, still smiling. "This just feels right." John's expression softened, his hands slipping down to rest on their shoulders. "It does," he agreed, his voice quiet but firm. "It really does." Then he moved his hand from their face to other places they hadn't been touched in a while, but it felt amazing. His manly hands felt amazing to them. Eventually, they went even further. He turned them around, and they think you can guess what happened that night. They can't really go into detail, but you have to understand that it was amazing, a little hurtful, but that didn't matter. Finally, they could forget their worries, all the things at work, everything that worried them. They could forget it for a moment, and when he finished, he pulled back and sat down on the couch. They curled up against him and forgot the world around them for a moment. They stayed like that for a while, the storm outside raging on as the quiet between them settled into something more comfortable. There was no need for words, no need to define what had just happened. It was enough to simply exist in the moment, to feel the weight of his presence and know that something had shifted between them, something that couldn't be undone. Eventually, the storm began to subside, the rain easing into a gentle patter against the windows. John glanced at the clock, a reluctant sigh escaping as he leaned back. "I should probably head home before it gets too late," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't really want to go. "You don't have to," they said quickly, the words slipping out before they could think better of them. John raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a small smile. "You sure?" They nodded, their heart pounding as they met his gaze. "Yeah," they said softly. "Stay." John's smile widened, and he leaned in to press a quick, gentle kiss to their forehead. "Okay," he said simply. As the night wore on, they talked and laughed, simply enjoying each other's company. The storm outside served as the perfect backdrop to the quiet intimacy that had grown between them. And as they eventually settled onto the couch, John's arm draped over their shoulders, they couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment they hadn't felt in years. Whatever this was, whatever it would become, they knew one thing for certain. They didn't want to let it go. Up until this day, they still find themselves replaying that stormy night in their mind. The way it started with a simple knock on the door and spiraled into something that would change their life forever. Every time they glance at the router in the corner of their apartment, they can't help but smile, reminded of how a mundane Wi-Fi problem brought John into their life in a way they never anticipated. They've come a long way since then. That night was just the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted, but it's become a story they laugh about now, telling friends how he heroically came to fix their connection and stayed to mend something deeper they didn't even know was broken. Life with John has been a whirlwind of moments like that. Unexpected, filled with laughter, and grounded in the quiet understanding they found that night. He still teases them about their DIY attempts to fix things before calling him, and they still roll their eyes when he smugly reminds them that he's just a hallway away if they ever need him. It's their little dance, one that feels as natural as breathing sometimes. When the rain falls hard against the windows, they think back to the way the storm seemed to mirror everything they were feeling inside. Chaotic, unsteady, and overwhelming. But just like the skies eventually cleared, so did their doubts and uncertainties. John became their calm after the storm, a steady presence in a world that had always felt a little too unpredictable. They did it a couple times more after that first night, although they still haven't labeled what they are. But they feel like maybe they don't need to. What matters is how he shows up for them. Not just when things are breaking down, but in the quiet, everyday moments too, whether it's over coffee in the morning, sharing stories from their day, or sitting in comfortable silence as the city hums around them. There's a sense of connection that makes them feel like they've finally found their place. Looking back, they never would have guessed that such an ordinary evening could spark something so extraordinary, but they're grateful for it every day. For the storm, the faulty Wi-Fi, and the neighbor who turned out to be so much more. If you enjoyed this heartfelt story, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment below. Share your thoughts. Did you connect with the characters? What's your favorite part of the story? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a new episode of LGBT Stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.